Mosquitoes are often regarded as the most dangerous species on Earth due to their capacity to spread disease. And in the past decade, an invasive mosquito species, previously found only in tropical regions, has been making itself at home in the United States. The Aedes aegypti mosquito is known to carry an array of deadly viruses, including dengue and Zika. And recently, it has been found in New Mexico, Utah, Idaho, and even western Colorado.
This mosquito shouldn't be able to survive at all in the Mountain West. But researchers say it's not only surviving, it's thriving. The insect is hard to control or kill, and its absolute favorite food is human blood. As ice retreats and new shipping routes open, species go where they couldn't before. And climate change can make control tools like aquatic barriers less effective. Invasive species play havoc on ecological balance, agriculture, and health. And they're just one example of alterations brought about by climate change.
But even with invasive mosquitoes, rising temperatures, and increased climate catastrophes, not everyone is convinced that we need to do anything about climate change. Some people think it's a hoax or an exaggeration, and even those theoretically committed to doing something about it seem to be doing less than they need to.
On Monday, November 10th, the 2025 United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP30 Climate Summit, opened in Brazil. It's a meeting for world leaders and experts to address climate challenges. This year, the United States is conspicuously absent, and climate experts note that geopolitical efforts to address climate issues are losing traction in general.
How should Catholics respond to the shifts in our climate and the effects that these changes bring about? How should Catholics respond when national leaders dismiss climate issues as unimportant? What does the Church really teach about climate change? That's what we're going to discuss on this episode of Glad You Asked.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask, but not so easy to answer.
Hello, Emily. Usually I would not want to start this conversation by talking about the weather, but it seems kind of appropriate for this topic.
Does it? Wait, because I feel like we're seasonally appropriate for the first time in however long.
No, you don't have to talk about your weather, just the weather.
The weather. Okay. Yeah, something I wanted to talk about is I recently had an experience that really kind of solidified the impacts of climate change, because I feel like so often when we talk about it here in the United States, we know it's an issue, we can kind of see the impacts, but it doesn't really have an impact on our daily lives for most of us yet, right? I was recently in Tunisia, and we spent 5 days traveling around the south and talking to and visiting with indigenous Berber people who are still living in the same towns and villages that they've been living in for literally 2,000 to 3,000 years. And we were talking to this young man, he was probably in his mid-20s, and he was telling us that up until 5 years ago, his family, his village, all still practiced the same lifestyle that they had practiced for, again, thousands and thousands of years, which is they live for half the year in these cave villages, and then they travel to their what they call their oases. So each family has its own small farm. And he said, but we haven't been able to do that since 2020. That area, it's right on the edge of the Sahara Desert. They get on average 3 inches of rain. The past 5 years, they've only gotten 1 inch or less of rain every year, and there's nothing growing. So all of a sudden, these people who still rely on what they can grow to survive, all of a sudden they can't grow food, and they can't live the lifestyle that they have been living for millennia. And I think that, to me, really kind of brought this home, that we are so insulated from the effects of climate change, but there are people who are dealing with this on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's such a striking example, and that really kind of reiterates how disconnected we are, many of us in the United States, from the immediate effects of climate change and just from nature itself. I think if we're regarding nature as something kind of interesting or appealing that we dip into from time to time versus something that we're intimately connected with, it's a lot easier to dismiss. Like where I live in Ohio, we had really severe drought, and I had a tremendous amount of difficulty sourcing hay. It was an emergency. The hay prices were skyrocketing. People were ordering hay delivered from all over the place. And something I noticed is when I would talk to the farmers I was getting hay from, they would talk at length about the drought and how severe it was. And then I would say something about climate change, and it was like a curtain went down over their face. It was like, we're going to pretend that this isn't connected to something that's going on. And that to me, when the people who are suffering immediately because of this are still kind of refusing to acknowledge it, that highlights that there's a moral disconnect or a social disconnect.
Well, and that kind of gets at so you mentioned in the introduction that right now COP30 is happening. This podcast is going to be released on what is theoretically the last day, although one of our editors informs us that they often go late because they can't come to an agreement, which should surprise perhaps very few of us. But that the United States isn't participating this year. And I think that maybe speaks to how it, especially in the United States, it has become so politicized. And there is this kind of conflict for people of faith. Where do we come down on climate change and what to do around climate change when perhaps we're hearing various messaging from both our faith and our politics?
And yet, the church has really, even if not everyone realizes this or hears it in the pews or hears it in their bulletin, the church has been pretty outspoken about this. There was the bishop's letter from the Global South that came out, what was that, in July? So the bishops in their letter made a pretty strong demand. They said COP30, we demand that the states take transformative action based on human dignity, the common good, solidarity, and social justice, prioritizing the most vulnerable, including our sister, Mother Earth.
And I also want to kind of stress like how unusual it is for bishops from a variety of countries who aren't in the same bishops conference, right, to come together to publish something like this. Like this was a big deal and required a lot of collaboration and talking together that we don't normally see. And so yeah, that kind of gets us to the topic of today's episode, which is we're going to talk about the church's teaching on climate change, how Catholics should respond to climate issues, and what we owe the planet. I'm Emily Zana, one of the hosts of Glad You Asked.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss. Before we get into the interview, though, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org.
Now, back to the question of the day. What does the church really teach about climate change?
To help us answer this question, we talked to Lorna Gold, the executive director at the Laudato Si movement. Gold has worked as executive director of Faith Invest, an international network of religious social impact investors, and as policy and advocacy manager with the Irish Catholic Agency for International Development.
Gold has a PhD in economic geography from the University of Glasgow and worked in the Department of Politics in the University of York. She writes extensively on ecological justice and global economic and social development. Hi, Lorna. We're so glad you could join us on the podcast today.
It's lovely to be here with you.
So you're the executive director of the Laudato Si movement. And so taking the mission statement from your website, the Laudato Si movement is a global organization with a mission to encourage and support the Catholic Church in living out its teachings on care for creation. And so today, when we talk about care of creation, we're often talking about issues like environmental justice, biodiversity loss, pollution, climate change. To start off the conversation, could you just kind of give us a grounding of the state of the world when it comes to some of these concerns?
Well, thanks, Emily. It's great to be here with you today. I think for me, if I look around and see what's happening in relation to issues of ecological justice or biodiversity, I would say that the picture is quite mixed on a global level. So on the one hand, there's lots of action happening. There's lots of action happening at the grassroots level, within the business community, within different governments, different states, different organisations, and even within our own movement. We see a real flourishing of activity at the grassroots level and lots of solutions being put forward for many issues. So if you look at what's happening on the ground, you could be full of hope. And also the sense, certainly from where I am, I'm based in Europe, so we'll come on later maybe to talk more about the US context, but a real sense of people also waking up and a greater consciousness of the crisis that we're facing. So that's on the positive side. But then if you then shift and look at the science of what's happening, it paints a very different picture. And when I say the science, I'm talking about the fact that despite all the efforts that we've seen in the last 20, 30 years to address climate change, to address biodiversity loss, to address issues like modification of biogeochemicals, stratospheric ozone layer, well, that's the one success actually. Things are generally looking quite grim, quite bleak. And I think that to me, one of the best reports that's very well respected now that points to this is an Earth Systems report called the Planetary Health Check. We have this very sophisticated reporting system now, which combines all 7 of the world, the planet's boundaries. I won't go through all of those. I just encourage people to look up Planetary Health Check and you'll see it's very, very accessible. But if you look at the science around the planetary boundaries, you can see that out of the 7 identified, let's say, life support systems on Earth, we are now breaching or at high risk of breaching 7 out of the 9. So that includes issues like ocean acidification, freshwater change, land system change, climate change, obviously, introduction of novel entities into the atmosphere, change of the biosphere integrity. They're complex scientific processes, but scientists have said we're now breaching 7 out of 9. I mentioned stratospheric ozone layer is one of the 2 that we're actually doing something about, and we're going in the right direction. And that was as a result of a multilateral process almost 30 or over 30 years ago now, which led to the protocol on protecting the ozone layer.
So the scientific consensus is quite clear that these issues are real and that they are serious. But here in the United States, especially, there are a lot of people who aren't convinced that these are issues or they don't think they need to care about it. What's responsible for all of this misinformation and disinformation that gets circulated about issues pertaining to climate change? And why do you think so many people fall for this?
I think it's one of the most challenging and difficult questions that we're facing today. And there's so many different layers to this topic. It's quite hard to kind of unpick the layers and to identify one particular, let's say, reason why this issue of misinformation is growing. And I say that not to get out of the question or to get out of answering it, but because even when you start to try and provide a kind of it's this or it's that, you start to sound like the kind of conspiracy theories that actually create the problem in the first place. So I'll have an attempt to kind of to answer it, but I think, as I say, it's very complex, and I think that we'll only know the answer to this really in hindsight. Maybe 20, 30 years down the road, we'll be saying something like, why were so many of us taken in? Why didn't we do something? Because if you look around you, like taking all the misinformation out of the kind of equation for a second, and we think about changes that we ourselves have witnessed in the environment over the past couple of decades, but certainly the acceleration of those changes, we are staring at climate change and the kind of changes in our environment. We're staring them in the face. We're literally seeing them with our own eyes. I can think myself of even going on holiday a couple of years ago to France and going to visit the glacier the Mer de Glace on Mont Blanc. And there were pictures there of the glacier 100 years ago. And then, which was at the level of where you got off this funicular train. We had to walk down hundreds of steps to get to where the glacier is now. And each of the steps, they marked a decade. They showed you this is where it was in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, until you got down to 2022 when we went to visit. And you saw this, like, I tell you, walking back up those steps in the heat was a real physical kind of reminder of climate change, how it is. But I think that so we're staring these things we're seeing them with our own eyes, and yet there's this ability to have cognitive dissonance. I mean, this is the word that the psychologists are using for this. This detachment. We want to believe a certain narrative, and because our social media feeds us that narrative, it's like positive reinforcement. I mean, we can see this in many different parts of our lives, and we're not aware of it. It's often very subtle. It's not like it's kind of outright denial often of the science, but it's enough to just sow a little bit of doubt. But if you think about the science of climate and it's not just climate change, the science of ecological kind of issues right now, Earth system science. The analogy I like to use is about smoking and lung cancer. We used to think that smoking was completely, well, right at the start of it, people thought it was good for you. They actually thought that if you smoked, it would be good for you. Now, you'd struggle to find a health professional who says that smoking is good for you. There's any health benefits. It's almost like 99% would say it's really bad for you. There is a very strong connection to all sorts of cancers. The similar thing could be said about climate and Earth system sciences. There is such a high level of agreement on the science that we are allowing ourselves to be taken in by the 1%. So what I would say to people about that, the 1%, if 1% of doctors, if you were to go with the 1% of doctors who said that smoking was good for you, when 99% say it's bad for you, we just wouldn't do it. But because these issues like climate change are they feel distant from us still, even though they are becoming closer. We all have witnessed Hurricane Melissa. We've witnessed other incredibly powerful hurricanes, droughts, fires with increasing frequency. And yet we're somehow, for all our ingenuity as a species, we're discovering that we are quite susceptible to groupthink and we're quite susceptible to cognitive dissonance. I just encourage people to always look at who's behind, to try and understand who's behind sowing misinformation and sowing doubt and sowing inaction. And I think that certainly in the work that I do with the Laudato Si movement, we have to look at some of you could call them bad actors, you could call them people who, or not people, but organisations, institutions who have repeatedly covered up facts, such as the fossil fuel industry, and have sown that misinformation so to the point that it becomes part of the fabric of our society. And so it's a very tricky issue, but yeah, it's not an easy one to come up with a quick answer to.
You also have people who accept the science, but see climate change or environmental justice as only a political topic, right? Not a spiritual or theological or moral one. What would you say to people who have that mindset, right? Why is it so important that Catholics respond to the climate crisis?
Well, I think you could say the same about any issue that is to do with economic or social justice that is political, because life is political. Life is, we're political animals, not with a capital P. Like when you say political with a capital P, you're referring to a political party. But if you're talking about the polis, the word political comes from polis, which means the city. We have, as citizens, as Christians, as Catholics, a responsibility towards the common good, towards whether it's the city, whether it's the state, whether it's the world, and towards issues that affect both people. So you could say the issues of migration, of homelessness, of poverty, all those issues of injustice. And also the planet, or Pope Francis always spoke of this as the two sides of the one coin, or the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and how interconnected these are. Because I like to think, if I was a family, if the human family needs a home, you can't talk about the family without talking about the home. So if the home is in a state of disrepair, as our planet is, then the family is going to suffer. And we see this all the time in terms of issues of people who can no longer survive as a result of environmental degradation. I came into the work on climate change and ecology through my work on social justice. I worked for the Caritas in Ireland, Trócaire, for 20 years. And I can say honestly, like, we never really worried about issues of climate change here in Ireland. It's a bit cold and damp, and it's actually quite a benign climate. And there's even a kind of group of people in Ireland, I would say, who think that we could do with a little bit of warming up. It would maybe benefit us. But for me, the issue of climate and environment, the connection, came when I was in Africa, and I was working with farmers, women farmers, who kept saying, I was doing a piece of research on kind of development trends, and they were saying, but the rains are not coming. And this is happening with greater frequency. And the rain's not coming means we don't know when to plant, we don't know when to sow. And the impact of that on families, all the work that we've been doing for decades with our humanitarian programs, was starting to unravel. And we would have the conversations with them and say, but does this not normally happen? Is this not just a kind of natural phenomenon? And they would say, no, something is shifting, something is changing. And those people are so connected to their environments that we started to investigate then with Trócaire to see what the bigger trend was here. And we realised that climate change was really an issue of justice. It wasn't just an issue of, caring for the planet's sake, but it was an issue that affected people in poverty, in particular women in poverty, because the outcome of them not having enough income from farming was that the husbands had to move away. So then you have female-headed households, you have other issues of family breakup that can happen as a result of that. So they're deeply interconnected, and I think we need to kind of reflect on the fact maybe that if you go back to the Gospels and you go back to Jesus himself and his preaching, he was very political. He wasn't a shy, retiring violet who sat in the corner and just kind of, it wasn't all about, his message was not all meekness. You know, it was a message back in those times that had a strong social, political message of hope, but also one that he didn't shy away to speak truth to those who were in power. And I think that's really important today when we see what's happening around us, to have that courage to speak truth to power.
So, is there a difference in how the Catholic Church in the United States engages with this issue versus how the Catholic Church is engaging with it in other countries around the world? And if so, what's driving that dynamic?
I mean, I'm not in the US myself. I'm in Ireland, so I wouldn't really be the one to know in detail how the bishops, for example, are responding in particular. But I do know that from our movement, what's happening, and we have a lot going on, and it's perhaps happening under the surface, and it's not really kind of seen more at a national level. We've been working very closely with the Catholic Climate Covenant that I'm sure you'll be familiar with, and working to build a greater collaboration and unity amongst all the different Catholic organisations on this topic. And despite the, let's say, the difficult context in which it's happening, we've seen 21 different Catholic organisations come together this year to carry out pilgrimages for climate action. They're calling them pilgrimages of hope. And it's been the most incredibly uplifting experience. With 250 pilgrimages have happened across 42 different states. And these are people, ordinary Catholics, who want to express their concern for the environment. And we're also seeing a real growth in the number of people who are signing up to our Laudato Si Animators programme. But that's not to say that it's all, let's say, it's all rosy. Everything's positive. I think there's many people in our movement as well who would like to see the bishops and the hierarchy being more forthright on issues of climate and being prepared to challenge where there is misinformation, much as Pope Leo did when he came to our recent conference, Raising Hope. He really spoke out against those who would deride the climate science. And it was very powerful, a very powerful moment when he spoke those words, and he actually blessed the glacial waters. So I would say that there is a grassroots movement in the US. Issues of resistance from clergy are not unique to the US either. I don't think we can not hide behind it, but say, oh, it's unique. The US is unique. There's problems, or there's bishops or clergy who are resisting this. It's true in other countries as well. And there's a lot of work that needs to happen to bring the clergy up to speed on some of these topics. I'll just give one example, that in Ireland, which wouldn't probably be renowned for maybe progressive Catholicism, and although we have many religious orders coming out of Ireland, when Laudato Si came out, the bishops were very quiet. And that happened for a few years. There wasn't much action or thought, and a group of us came together to say, we need to do something on this. We formed a working group. We got the bishops to approve it. And then we really understood that for most of the bishops, the issue was one of feeling they weren't competent to speak on these topics. It wasn't an issue of resistance. It was an issue of feeling they might almost be embarrassed if they spoke and they mixed up the ozone layer with the climate emissions, or they would face resistance from their local communities. So we offered to do a training for them. And it was one of the most transformative days. So we actually came to their retreat. We did a full day of training. We brought climate scientists. And it shifted something for the bishops, because we weren't trying to pressure them into changing. We were actually engaging with their concerns, and we were engaging with the theology, and we were deepening their understanding of the issues. And I think that really helped. It led to Ireland becoming the first bishops' conference to divest their investments from fossil fuels, which then had a knock-on effect with the whole country here, because they saw a leadership role for the church here. And that has continued over the years.
So the Laudato Si movement gets its name from Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. And I think that over the past 10 years, Laudato Si has become a shortcut for talking about the church's teachings on environmental issues. Very few people seem to feel the need to go further in church teaching than Laudato Si. So where else in the church can people look to for inspiration, education, guidance when it comes to our humans' relationship with nature and how to act given everything we're facing? Are there other resources, traditions, examples out of environmental teaching?
It's a really good question, and I think that's a common misunderstanding, is that somehow, because Pope Francis was a certain character and he was charismatic and he prioritised this issue, that somehow it started with Pope Francis, but that could not be further from the truth. At the time I was working in Chokra, and Pope Benedict, we called him the Green Pope because of his pronouncements on the World Day of Prayer for Creation, or the World Day of Prayer for Peace, and the connection he made with ecology. Human ecology was a big topic that he liked to focus on. We called him the Green Pope. And then Saint Pope John Paul II spoke very often about the kind of contradiction between climate, not so much climate, but environment and human development. And I think some people may have got kind of caught in the kind of post-Vatican II, the focus was very much in terms of human development and human progress and concern for humanity. And perhaps there was less focus at that time on the environmental limits and the interconnection between climate and environment and human development. And I think that has shifted. That has most definitely shifted in terms of the church teaching. Certainly, if you look at the whole theology of liberation, the teachings of Leonardo Boff, and the Catholic social thought, which is kind of not strictly Catholic social teaching, but it's part of the broader tradition, you can see many strands which interconnect climate, environmental justice, and social justice. But I think that the tradition is even deeper than that. It's not just the whole question of stewardship of nature, stewardship of God's creation, goes way back into the kind of, right back into the history of great saints and scholars of the church. If I look back all the way to Saint Hildegard of Bingen, who's one of my favourite saints, a German saint, who really, a Benedictine, who wrote about the earth. She was a mystic, a visionary. There's that whole tradition, even looking at the Celtic saints in Ireland, that deep tradition of Celtic Christianity, which is somehow, it's those traditions are still there, but they've not been as active or as present in the church, perhaps in the mainstream of the Catholic Church in recent years. But the Laudato Si movement as an organisation isn't just about Laudato Si. One of the interesting things about our movement is it's a network. So it's a network of over 500 Catholic organisations, and many more are affiliated. So those Catholic organisations range from the Jesuits, the Salesians, the Franciscans. We also have many Catholic lay associations, such as the Catholic Scouts are part of the movement, church movements like Focolare movement, others that are all participating in this network. And what we discover is that those groups, it's not like they adopt some new philosophy or idea, but they take this idea of caring for the common home, caring for the earth, and they bring it back into their tradition. So the Franciscans rediscovering the teachings of St. Francis, the Jesuits really, this year they have done phenomenal work. If you just look up the Jesuits and all the work they're doing on ecology this year ahead of the climate negotiations, they've done a whole series of podcasts. Those are Jesuit podcasts, but they're also deeply, it's almost like rediscovering this deeper connection with caring for the earth. And I think that, to me, in my very humble opinion, is like the action of the Holy Spirit. Because the Holy Spirit always calls us to the signs of the times, calls us to make new the message of the gospel for the times that we're living in today. And what could be more timely than to recognise the interconnection and the interdependency of caring for our fellow brothers and sisters and caring for the planet and the earth that God's given us.
So, amid all of this, the climate tipping points, rapid technology advances, the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, expansion of pipelines, what's giving you hope right now that God's creation isn't doomed to climate catastrophe? Sometimes it's very tempting to despair.
I think, where I draw most of my inspiration is really from my faith. And I've been so blessed that I was given this really strong faith from my own mother, who sadly passed away recently. But I've been reflecting on it and on the faith that she gave me. And it's not a faith of a God that's somewhere far away and kind of, remote remote control or something, but a faith that's in a God that's very close to us and with us, and is with us especially when we decide to act together in favour of the creation, in favour of social justice. And we experienced that recently when we were in Rome at this amazing event that we held for the 10th anniversary of Laudato Si, which was called Raising Hope. And everybody pointed to it that here we are at a moment where there's so much despair, and yet we come together in a spirit of conversion, recognising that we have a lot to change in ourselves, a lot to change in our world, but also almost crying out to our Father to say, help us, we need help here, we want to do something. But a real sense that there's joy there as well. It was the most extraordinary experience with Pope Leo, to experience joy in the midst of crisis that we're in. And to me, what that says, I think that I've been shaped as well by the fact that I lived through two major changes when I was a teenager. One was the fall of the Berlin Wall, which nobody expected. And the other was the end of apartheid, which nobody really expected to happen so quickly. And I guess what that taught me was things can change in an instant. Just when it seems that the darkness is so real, and it is real, and the political forces are so oppressive to us, just when we expect it all to end, something can show up, things can change. And that is a belief that I continue to hold. And when I see the miracle of the Laudato Si movement, that 10 years ago there was nothing there. We weren't, and nobody of us was planning to start a movement. We didn't really have any intentions. We just wanted to try to live our faith in a way that was coherent with the message of environmental justice and to live well. And through that, this movement has started to emerge. And we don't know where that will lead, but I certainly feel that the Holy Spirit is at work and that things can change. And I think the difference what gives me hope is acting in that direction. I think that there's a wonderful person who also passed away this year called Joanna Macy, and I've read a lot of her books, and she talks about the idea of active hope. And active hope is really saying that hope is not a feeling. I mean, I get up in the morning and sometimes, I'll be honest, I don't feel like coming on podcast. I do today, of course, but I don't necessarily feel it. But hope is more than a feeling. Christian hope is more than a feeling. Christian hope is about determination, and it comes into play when the chips are down. We don't need to be hopeful when everything's rosy. We need to be hopeful when things look like they're at risk, or that an active hope is like the virtue of hope, an active way of living into that future. And I don't have time to despair. That's the reality these days. There's so much happening, and so many people who want to work with us and to be working for a safe future for our children and for humanity.
We always ask all of our guests at the very end, if listeners take just one thing away from this conversation today, what would you want that one thing to be?
It might sound strange, but I would say reconnect with nature. Go outside. Fall in love with nature again. Get off our phones, get off our devices, reconnect, rediscover, and look at a leaf, look at a flower, and rediscover the wonder. Because that's at the heart of the change that we need, is to rediscover that sense of awe and wonder. Because at the end of the day, we will only fight, or we will only strive to save what we love and to save what we care for. So that's my one little piece of advice for people, and everything else will follow.
Thank you so much for talking to us today. That was really great. So I think if I had come to this discussion not convinced that I was supposed to care about climate change, I think Lorna would have really convinced me. Was there anything that surprised you about this discussion?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that struck me was her story about the Irish bishops. That when she and her colleagues asked the bishops why they weren't speaking out about climate change, their answer wasn't that they didn't think it was an issue, but more that they felt unqualified to speak about it and they were scared of messing up. And I think we don't necessarily ever think about church inaction as caused by uncertainty or fear rather than strident disbelief in something. And I think that was just kind of a good reminder that there are still a lot of barriers to talking or preaching about this that people might feel, and that silence isn't necessarily a disagreement. I don't know if that means that even those who are unsure don't have a responsibility to speak up, as I think Lorna pointed out and made a very convincing argument for. But I do think that it kind of reframes maybe some of the silence we've seen on the part of the church.
Yeah, and kind of maybe following on that, maybe what surprised me was, in light of that, Lorna's hopefulness, because it's very, very easy to get discouraged. And, as my story earlier about the farmers suggests, I'm kind of geographically surrounded by people who are in hardcore denial. Like, we had really catastrophic flooding in a neighboring village, and I think they're still struggling to recover from that. And there was just this adamant refusal to acknowledge it was an issue. I know that some people are hearing about it in their churches, but when you're not hearing about it, when you're not surrounded by other people who are working to do something about it, it's extremely easy to become hopeless. And I appreciated the reminder that we can have hope.
Yeah, I thought it was good and important that she pointed out the cognitive dissonance, that so many of us can see climate change with our own eyes and still manage to doubt it or to make a case for why something else is going on. I don't think I had articulated to myself how much these kind of feedback loops reinforce that kind of seeing, whether it's social media or the news or just the people we surround ourselves with. our society is in many ways kind of organized to foster this kind of cognitive dissonance. And I think that happens not just on the people that you're talking about who maybe like don't want to admit what is behind some of these climate catastrophes, but also happens even on the side of people who do acknowledge that climate change is a problem, right? Like we all kind of have this cognitive dissonance about the true effects that it's going to have.
Yeah, and I think part of that is just feeling, like I'm one tiny little person, what can I do? And I usually can't stand that kind of talk. I'm like, yeah, but there's lots of us, go and do your part. But even I threw something in the trash the other day that I should have taken out to the compost. And I was like, well, there I go. I'm giving up. Um,
I also have this. We pay for compost, for a curbside compost recycling, as part of our trash pickup. And the bucket has been dirty. I haven't used it this week because we need a new clean bucket, and the bucket's so gross I don't want to bring it into my kitchen. And I'm getting a clean one on Friday, but I keep thinking, oh no, I'm throwing away so many food scraps. What am I doing? And of course, this is such a tiny drop in the bucket. So yeah, and I think that is it's so hard to wrap our heads around the scope of the problem, right? And that is a different kind of cognitive dissonance. Is focusing on the compost, like that banana peel that I just put in the trash. That is also, I think, also kind of maybe sometimes keeps us from having constructive conversations in faith communities. So yeah, is there anything that you wish we'd talked more about?
Yeah, something I find really interesting is I know that the Catholic Church has long taught that we have a moral commitment to the earth that we live on. What I'm curious about is historically at what point church officials started really engaging with this question, which, because I was in a conservative Catholic space when the discourse around what was then called global warming was kind of starting to gain traction, I wasn't hearing what the church authorities may have been saying. I mean, the Pope Benedict was known as the Green Pope, and a lot of people who admired Pope Benedict for other theological reasons didn't really amplify what he was saying about care for creation and climate in particular. So, yeah, I would just be really curious to see how the church was kind of engaging with the topic, how they got from that moment to the moment of all of these bishops who I'm sure come down in different areas of theological interpretation on other issues all managed to agree and put out such a strong and prophetic statement.
I mean, I actually kind of know the answer to this question.
Oh, good.
Um, so when I was in college, I wrote my undergraduate thesis on Catholic environmental theology, and this was back in 2008, 2009, 2000. I graduated in 2010, and the conversation was really different. There weren't any sources really that were Catholic environmental theologies. There were people like Elizabeth Johnson. There, Pope Benedict had written some things, but had a much more kind of instrumental look at climate. And so my thesis was looking at these groups of women religious around the country who had all integrated care for creation into their vows in some way. And so, what my thesis did was to say that there is no articulated theology that explains why these women are doing this. Here's one theology that might explain it that is purely based on Catholic resources. But to my knowledge, when I wrote my thesis, no one had done that. And I remember in 2015 when Laudato Si came out, 5 years later, all of a sudden I was thinking all of that work is moot now because Pope Francis came along and did the same thing way more but better than I could at the age of 22. But yeah, I think we forget now how much that changed the conversation. That really there were no resources to start to have a conversation about overall what the church thought about its place in creation. There were bits and snippets here and there, and you could kind of pull them together, but there was no way to talk about this as a whole. And that really Pope Francis did change everything about how we talk about ecological justice and care for creation.
So that's really fascinating because I know that a lot of Catholics are very comfortable with the church moving slowly and they want the church to move slowly and they would like to be given 500 years to have a teaching sit there percolating before they finally assent to it. And that's probably not going to be the best approach when it comes to something like climate disasters that need to be fended off, and we all need to work together on it.
You mentioned that she was very hopeful. And I think that was one thing that I wished we'd gotten the time to kind of dig deeper into is what about when you don't feel hopeful? What resources does our faith have when we do feel paralyzed by anxiety about the climate or just despair in general? Does our faith offer kind of resources for moving through that? And I did want to just kind of like sit in that is a really valid way to feel sometimes when we face the reality of climate change. And so I wanted to kind of honor that was a feeling that people, including myself, often have.
Yeah, and that's also, I mean, that's a great question. I would like to ask that too, because usually I would fall back on, yes, we have the tradition of lament. um, we we sit by the river and we beat our breasts and we weep for what is lost. And I'm curious to know if there's other resources beyond lament that can inspire us to kind of, get up from the riverside and carry on.
Yeah, I mean, moving on to our last question, I keep thinking that that's a sermon I would like to preach, something about climate despair and kind of what our faith has to say about it, moving through lament, kind of the dark night of the soul, and kind of looking at that in a intersectional way too, because I think my despair sitting here has to look really different from like the young Tunisian man I met. Yeah, his village can't grow food. So I think it also has to consider kind of the phrase that she used was the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor.
Yeah, I think oddly enough, even though my own inclination is to lament and beat my breast, my sermon would be a reminder for people to carry on. But I think simply because of my experiences with the people who deny this, I would want to direct a sermon specifically at them, inviting them to recover a sense of care and wonder for the world that we live in and species that are not our own, people who are different from ourselves, and to try to recover that sense of the love that Jesus had when he looked at everyone. What does that love drive us to do? It needs to drive us to act.
That's our show. Thanks again for joining us for Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast or leave us a review or rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us next week when we talk about whether the church supports universal health care.
Before we conclude this episode, we'd like to invite you to join us in prayer at the National Shrine of St. Jude, which was founded by our sponsors, the Claretian Missionaries, in 1929. As the patron saint of impossible causes, St. Jude offers hope to millions. Our National Shrine of St. Jude provides a peaceful place for renewal, belonging, and a deeper connection to God. Send in your prayer petitions today. We will place them on the altar of St. Jude to be held in prayer all year. Visit shrineofstjude.org today. Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Sana, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss. We're produced by Stephanie Clary and Joki Mercuria, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.